Hello everyone, and welcome to my General Hospital Today channel. The wedding hall was filled with the usual elegance of Port Charles's finest celebrations. White roses lined the aisle, golden candelabras cast flickering light on the polished floors, and soft classical music played in the background, but the festive air could not mask the tension simmering beneath the surface. Michael Corinthos arrived unannounced, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd until they locked on Willow Tate, who stood at the altar in her flowing white gown, her hands slightly trembling as she clasped her bouquet. The moment she saw him, her composure wavered, as if she already sensed that everything she had been planning was about to unravel. Michael didn't hesitate, he strode forward with purpose, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter, and he revealed truths that Willow could no longer ignore, truths that left the entire congregation gasping in shock. Drew Kane, her intended, her soon-to-be husband, had a past so complicated, so dark, that it threatened to topple not just their relationship but the very foundations of trust and loyalty upon which Willow had built her life. Secrets long buried came to the surface, exposing Drew's most shocking misdeeds, the very actions that, if made public, could destroy him legally, financially, and emotionally. Willow's mind raced as Michael spoke, each revelation landing like a hammer blow against her carefully constructed plans. She realized, in that moment, that marrying Drew wasn't just about love, not about redemption or forgiveness, it was a calculated gamble, a chance to wield the law itself as a weapon, to maneuver around a system that had threatened her own freedom. In a flash, the pieces of her strategy aligned. By marrying Drew, she could secure her place in his will, guaranteeing financial security for herself and her children should tragedy strike, and, more importantly, she could ensure that the law would never touch her again for the crime she had been accused of. Double jeopardy loomed large in her thoughts, the legal doctrine promising that once she was exonerated, there would be no second trial, no chance for the state to accuse her again of the same attempt on Drew's life. She had originally justified the marriage to herself and to Drew as an act of love, a reconciliation born from the chaos that had defined their relationship, but now she saw that the truth was far more strategic. She needed Drew to marry her, not merely for appearances, but for protection, for leverage, and for the freedom to control the outcome of her own life without interference from Michael, Carly Spencer, or anyone else who might try to interfere. Every subtle gesture, every whispered word, every promise she made had been carefully calculated to maintain the illusion of innocence, to ensure that Drew remained oblivious to the danger he was courting by trusting her. Even Drew had acknowledged the strategic advantage of marriage, though he had framed it as mutual convenience, an alignment of legal and personal interests, and for a fleeting moment, Willow had almost believed it. Almost. In reality, her mind had been running scenarios, contingencies, plans within plans, how she could maneuver Drew, how she could safeguard her children, and how she could manipulate the perception of the public, the courts, and even Drew himself. The stakes were higher than they had ever been, and Willow was acutely aware that any misstep could unravel everything she had worked for. The question of Scout Quartermain also weighed heavily on her conscience, a variable she could not ignore. Drew had always envisioned a family life that included Willow, himself, Wiley, Amelia, and Scout, the daughter he had raised with care, but Scout's perception of him had shifted. She had noticed the darker changes, the manipulations, the betrayals, and she had begun to distance herself, longing instead for the stability offered by the Quartermain mansion, the guardianship of Danny Morgan, or the nurturing presence of her grandmother Alexis Davis and her aunts Christina Corinthos Davis or Molly Lansing Davis. Willow recognized the truth in Scout's judgment. The child deserved a life free from Drew's increasingly dangerous shadow, yet Willow could not ignore the fact that, should Drew die, her inheritance would secure Scout's future as well. She had no desire to harm the child, only to ensure that she, and by extension, her children, would be safe and provided for, while simultaneously consolidating the leverage that marriage afforded her. The moral lines blurred, shifting beneath her feet, but Willow remained resolute. This was not cruelty, not malice, but strategy, survival, and, in a sense, justice of her own design. As Michael's revelations echoed through the hall, Drew's expressions shifted from confident arrogance to bewildered alarm, his eyes searching Willow's face for the trust he had always assumed, only to find a calm, calculated determination staring back. The realization struck him slowly, like a dagger wrapped in velvet. He had underestimated her, as many men did, assuming that love and loyalty were her guiding principles when in fact strategy, protection, and legal cunning ruled her every move. Willow's mind had already moved several steps ahead: how she would navigate the fallout of this wedding being called off, how she would explain to Drew that their marriage, if it even occurred, was not merely symbolic, but a crucial component in her plan for survival and power, and how she would ensure that the law could never touch her again. Michael's presence was a catalyst, an unavoidable trigger that brought to the surface the duality of Willow's intentions. She was capable of love, of care, of tenderness for her children and even, at moments, for Drew, but she was equally capable of manipulation, foresight, and calculated risk-taking. Every step she had taken up to this point, the plea of innocence, the initial hesitation to marry, the careful navigation around Drew's suspicions, had been a delicate balance of appearances versus reality, perception versus truth. Now, as she stood in the center of a hall full of witnesses, the weight of double jeopardy, inheritance law, and familial obligations pressed upon her, demanding decisive action. Willow knew that calling off the wedding was inevitable, not just to protect herself but to reposition the entire board of pieces in her favor. She had to act, not in anger, not in impulsive betrayal, but with the precision of a chess master anticipating the opponent's next 10 moves. Drew's potential vulnerability was glaring. By marrying Willow, he had unwittingly opened the door to financial and legal exposure, his trust in her functioning as both shield and sword. If he were to die, her control over his estate would be absolute, yet she could not simply resort to the obvious. Any direct attack, any repeat of the original crime, would risk suspicion, casting shadows over her carefully orchestrated exoneration. Poison, manipulation of medications, even subtle accidents, these were the tools she now considered, each weighed against the likelihood of leaving a trail, of awakening Drew's inherent suspicion. Yet in the midst of this cold, calculated strategy, her heart still ached for Scout, for Wiley, for Amelia, for the children whose lives were intertwined with hers and with Drew's. She resolved, internally, that they would be protected, that the innocent would suffer no harm, and that justice, or at least her version of it, would be served. As the music faltered, a hush descending upon the room, Willow's gaze met Drew's one last time. There was no malice in her eyes, no outward hint of the intricate web she had woven in the shadows. Only clarity. Only purpose. Only a determination to survive, to protect, to strategize, and to secure a future where her children could thrive, even if it meant navigating the perilous waters of deceit, trust, and legal maneuvering. The wedding was called off, the vows unspoken, the truth laid bare before all, and as the stunned guests whispered and speculated, Willow moved forward, confident in her choices, aware that the game had changed forever. Drew had underestimated her, the law had its limitations, and Willow had emerged as both protector and strategist, a mother and a manipulator, a survivor in a world that demanded cunning as much as compassion. In that charged moment, amid shattered expectations and stunned silence, Willow Tate embraced her role as the master of her fate, knowing that every step she took from here on would be guided by one unshakable truth: in a world of secrets, lies, and shifting loyalties, only those who anticipate, calculate, and act decisively could hope to survive, and Willow had already made the first move. The aftermath of the wedding fiasco left the grand hall in stunned silence, the air thick with unspoken questions and shock. Guests whispered behind gloved hands and perfumed fans, eyes darting between Willow and Drew, both of whom now stood as figures of intrigue rather than celebration. Willow's heart raced, not with guilt, not with shame, but with the precise, controlled awareness of someone who understood that every reaction could be weaponized or leveraged. Michael's revelation had changed everything, not merely exposed Drew's secrets, but illuminated the hidden paths she could now navigate to secure her safety, her children, and her own freedom. As the crowd began to stir, she allowed a faint, almost imperceptible sigh to escape her lips, a signal to herself that the next phase had begun. Drew, on the other hand, looked unmoored, his confidence eroded by the truths revealed in the space of moments. He could feel it. Willow had evolved in his absence of suspicion, sharpened by necessity, and now wielded the law, perception, and her own cunning like instruments of survival. Willow's mind raced as she considered the implications of double jeopardy, a legal doctrine that, in her hands, became less of a rule and more of a weapon. She knew that once she was exonerated for the attempt on Drew's life, the state could not try her again for the same crime. She understood the subtle nuances. Double jeopardy applied strictly to the original instance, not to potential future schemes, but the risk of repeating an identical method remained a liability. Still, the fact that Drew could not predict her next move gave her an advantage she intended to exploit fully. She considered the possibilities: a subtle tampering with his medications, the carefully arranged accident that could be dismissed as unfortunate fate, the strategically placed evidence that would point elsewhere. Every potential plan was weighed against the twin needs of discretion and effectiveness. Any obvious action could unravel her exoneration and place her back in jeopardy. Drew's position was precarious. By agreeing to marry Willow, even as the wedding had been called off, he had already exposed himself to vulnerability. His estate, his assets, and the trust he placed in Willow, all of it was now a chessboard upon which she could maneuver with deadly precision. He had always assumed that her affections were genuine, that her desire to marry him was rooted in reconciliation and perhaps even love. But love was a luxury Willow could not afford. Survival required a combination of strategy, foresight, and ruthlessness. The wedding was never truly about romance, it was about leverage. And yet, Willow was not without a conscience, not entirely. Scout Quartermain's well-being remained a constant consideration. Willow understood that while Drew had once envisioned a harmonious blended family, that ideal had long since been fractured. Scout had grown wary of her father's changing behavior, the subtle manipulations and shifting moral compass that now defined his every action. She had begun to resent the instability, to long for the stability of the Quartermain mansion, the safe harbor of her grandmother Alexis, or the care of aunts Christina and Molly. Willow, with her characteristic cunning, recognized the truth in Scout's desires. The child deserved a life unshadowed by Drew's increasingly erratic behavior. In Willow's plan, Scout would not be left vulnerable. Her inheritance, her security, and her future would be protected, even if Drew were removed from the equation. The balance between morality and strategy became a delicate dance, one that Willow executed with measured steps, ensuring that her children and Scout remained safe while simultaneously consolidating her power. Michael, aware of the complexity of the situation, had not left immediately. He lingered, observing Willow with a mixture of suspicion and concern. He understood her capabilities, her intelligence, and, perhaps most dangerously, her ability to manipulate circumstances to her advantage. He knew she was calculating, always a few steps ahead, and the implications of double jeopardy were not lost on him. Michael was acutely aware that the original charges of attempted murder could no longer touch her once exonerated, but the possibility of new actions, new crimes, and new manipulations remained a threat not just to Drew, but to anyone who underestimated her. The web she wove was intricate and multi-layered, one that required constant vigilance to understand and, even then, could easily ensnare the unwary. Drew, meanwhile, began to internalize the depth of his predicament. He had assumed, foolishly perhaps, that his control over the narrative, over his life, and over Willow's intentions was absolute. Now, with the wedding called off and the truths laid bare, he realized the precariousness of his position. His assets, once thought secure, could be redirected by legal maneuvering. His trust, once considered unassailable, was now a liability. The very concept of double jeopardy, a safeguard in the legal system, became a lens through which he now saw his own vulnerability. By marrying Willow, he had inadvertently placed himself in a position where any harm or accident could benefit her immensely. His confidence faltered as he considered the worst-case scenarios that Willow had already considered and incorporated into her plans. Willow's focus shifted to the subtle manipulation of appearances. The cancellation of the wedding, while shocking to the gathered guests, was only the first step in a carefully orchestrated sequence. She needed the world to perceive her as wronged, as cautious, as protective of her children. Drew's secrets, now public through Michael's intervention, served her purpose perfectly. The whispers of scandal, the doubts cast upon Drew's integrity, and the sympathetic gaze of friends and family all reinforced her narrative. Willow, the vigilant mother and protective exonerated woman, standing against a man whose past misdeeds now justified her caution. Her strategy extended beyond immediate concerns. Willow recognized the long-term implications of her actions. Once exonerated, she could maneuver freely, consolidating her position while maintaining the moral high ground in the eyes of the law. Any direct harm to Drew would require subtlety, precision, and timing. She had to consider medications, environmental hazards, and indirect methods, ensuring that nothing could be traced back to her while simultaneously securing the inheritance and safeguarding her children. Every action required calculation, every decision weighed against both immediate and future consequences. The delicate balance of morality, legality, and personal gain defined Willow's strategy, and she executed it with the patience of a seasoned chess player, moving pieces silently and deliberately. Scout, meanwhile, was a silent observer of the unfolding drama. She noticed the changes in her father, the tension between him and Willow, and the cautious distance that now characterized their interactions. The child's instincts were accurate, Drew's world had shifted, and her placement within it required careful consideration. Willow's protection of Scout, combined with her own strategic maneuvering, ensured that the child would remain secure, loved, and financially provided for, even as the adults around her navigated a complex web of suspicion, loyalty, and survival. Michael's role in all of this remained pivotal. As the messenger of truth, he had disrupted the carefully balanced equation between Drew and Willow, exposing secrets that had been meticulously hidden. Yet he was also a witness, a potential deterrent, and a factor in Willow's calculations. She knew that any overt action on her part could be observed, analyzed, and countered. Her strategy had to account for Michael, for Carly, for the legal implications of her past actions, and for the ever-present possibility that Drew might uncover her true intentions. Drew, in the aftermath, began to grasp the depth of the threat Willow posed, not just emotionally, but legally, financially, and physically. The recognition that marrying her could place him in jeopardy, that his assets and trust were no longer secure, and that his own judgment had been flawed, left him reeling. The concept of double jeopardy, which had once seemed irrelevant to him, now loomed as both a shield and a sword in Willow's hands. He had trusted her implicitly, and that trust had become his vulnerability. Willow's mind continued to churn, exploring contingencies, planning multiple steps ahead. She considered Drew's possible reactions, the interventions of Michael and Carly, and the potential for unforeseen events that could derail her careful planning. Her focus was unwavering: protect the children, secure her position, and ensure that her legal and financial standing remained unassailable. Every scenario was analyzed, every potential outcome evaluated, and every decision made with the precision of someone who understood both the power and danger inherent in their situation. As the days following the cancelled wedding unfolded, Willow's control over the narrative became evident. She was perceived as cautious, protective, and morally upright, while Drew's past misdeeds cast him in a less favorable light. The legal and social implications of their interactions were carefully managed, with every word, gesture, and public appearance serving to reinforce her position. She maintained her focus on Scout, Wiley, and Amelia, ensuring their security while simultaneously consolidating her leverage over Drew. The concept of double jeopardy, inheritance law, and the careful orchestration of appearances became Willow's tools, allowing her to navigate a complex web of danger and opportunity. She understood that while Drew remained a potential threat, the legal protections afforded to her, combined with her strategic planning, provided a level of security that few could anticipate. Her actions were guided not by impulse, but by calculated foresight, ensuring that every move served multiple purposes: protection, consolidation, and preparation for the inevitable challenges ahead. In this intricate dance of morality, legality, and survival, Willow Tate emerged as a figure of both empathy and cunning. Her love for her children and Scout was genuine, yet her understanding of the power dynamics at play allowed her to operate with a level of strategic intelligence that few could match. The wedding, cancelled though it was, served as a pivot point, a moment of revelation that clarified her objectives and solidified her determination. Drew's vulnerabilities, Michael's interventions, and Scout's needs all intersected to create a landscape in which Willow's careful planning, foresight, and tactical execution could thrive. In the weeks that followed, Willow continued to maneuver carefully, maintaining the delicate balance between public perception and private strategy. Drew, increasingly aware of the precariousness of his position, began to second-guess his trust in those around him, yet he remained largely unaware of the depth of Willow's planning. Michael, vigilant as ever, monitored events, knowing that the next move in this dangerous game could come at any moment. And Scout, observing the adults around her, continued to seek stability and protection, finding reassurance in Willow's calculated care. Every decision Willow made was guided by a single, unshakable principle: protect her children, secure her freedom, and maintain her advantage in a world where loyalty, trust, and morality were constantly tested. The tension between ethical responsibility and strategic necessity defined her every action, shaping the complex and compelling narrative that now unfolded in Port Charles. The future remained uncertain, the potential for danger ever present, but Willow's determination, intelligence, and careful planning ensured that she would remain not merely a participant in this drama, but a master of its unfolding events.